Okay, so let's continue on our study of the story of philosophy. We're going to pick up here on this slide where we're going into the early modern period. So, the early modern period of philosophy is marked by the age of reason in the 17th century and then the age of enlightenment in the 18th century. Lots of advances in science here and lots of advances in religious tolerance as well. So, lot of thought and like development of thought going on. And basically, this kind of results in two like opposing viewpoints, two basic schools of thought: rationalism and empiricism. So, the rationalism is embodied by three big names. The first one is Descartes, um, and pretty much this guy, like once he kind of started putting out his ideas and going through his processes that we'll talk about here in a second, pretty much everything about Western philosophy after that is a result of his work and his viewpoints. So really interesting, very much a watershed moment for philosophy. And the reason why is because he wanted to, with all these questions about what we could know for sure and how we arrive at that knowledge, he wanted to make sure that the things that he knew were he really did know them, and that he knew them, and that he was justified in that. And so because of that, he basically everything threw out everything that could maybe even have a suspicion of doubt about it, and only go with what he knew for sure, which was a big process. I mean, he even said we can't even trust our senses, because those could be fooling us or they could be not working correctly, which, as you see, is in direct opposition to empiricism. Empiricism says knowledge is only gained through things we can experience with our senses. Descartes said, no, we can't know that for sure. The only things that we can know for sure are things that we can think through, which hence the name rationalism. Okay. So, he came to it's called an indubitable principle. Okay. Indubitable means it's unable to be doubted. The indubitable principle that he came up with was the fact that he had some kind of consciousness that he was able to think. This led him to the phrase, I think, therefore I am, the famous phrase. Really, the entire phrase is, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Because he started with doubting everything that he didn't have indubitable knowledge of. So this introduced this idea, it's called this idea of dualism, which kind of was the forerunner of the mind-body problem later. So dualism is the idea that humans are made of two distinct parts, a physical part and a non-physical part. And Descartes, through his rationalistic viewpoint, arrived at this idea that we can't even trust our senses. Our body is more like a machine, but it's guided by our mind or our consciousness, which is a non-physical entity. So this kind of led him to an understanding that humans are created, or humans are the type of creatures that have two parts to them. This introduced the mind-body problem several centuries later, which we'll go over a little bit later. Okay, the second really big name in the rationalism era was a Dutch person by the name of Baruch Spinoza. Okay, Spinoza. His ideas were kind of a reaction against Descartes, and they were that he didn't like the dualism idea of mind and body. He thought that everything was in this sort of self-contained metaphysical system, uh, and it's called monism, where everything is just a single underlying substance. And then what happens is that these could be different aspects, like different individual things could be different aspects of one underlying substance. So monism, you see the root there that means one. So everything is one substance, and then a body or a mind or anything else in the world that exists are merely different aspects of that one substance. So he rejected the idea of dualism and went on with monism. He also then thought that he was a determinist and thought that absolutely everything was determined. There's no room for free will. There's everything was operates. Everything does what it does because it's necessarily that way. That means then that it has some pretty decent effects on ethics. I mean, if everything happens because it has to be that way, then there's a pretty good chance at very little to no moral responsibility, which means also that the concepts of good and evil can't really don't really mean anything since everything is determined anyway. Okay, third big rationalist was German Gottfried Leibniz. Okay. So he saw inconsistencies in both Descartes and Spinoza. He thought he wanted to try to like blend the two maybe a little bit. So he thought that, listen, you guys are both wrong. Obviously, the real world is composed of, he kind of tried to blend the two. The real world is composed of things called monads. These are all non-material, independent elements. Okay, and that's what everything is made of. The real world, the real world is made up of monads. The material world that we experience with our senses is just a phenomena of those monads interacting with each other. I know this seems really strange, but again, remember these are people trying to find answers to questions about what is the world like, what are we like, how do we interact with the world, and so if they see inconsistencies, then they have to come up with another aspect. There's a certain point in philosophy where no question is a bad question. Then there's a certain point where questions definitely do get weird, and ideas that are offered are no longer valuable, but the idea is to continue to ask questions in the pursuit of truth. So he really was a really important logician. He probably the most important logician between Aristotle and more modern formal logic. Okay, on the other side of the tracks, in the early modern era, we have empiricism. And like rationalism, empiricism is embodied by three big names. So the first one is John Locke. You may recognize him because he's written a lot on philosophy, on human rights, on politics. So he says, now remember, empiricism is the idea that the things that we know for sure come from our senses. The only real knowledge can be gained through senses, through the scientific method, not just through rational thought. So he was an empiricist. He did think that knowledge comes from the senses, but he thought that may be a little bit sketchy. He thought people are. He believed in a blank slate. He believed that people are born without any innate ideas. But he did also believe that humans have natural rights by merit of them being a human. And so through that, he wrote, that led him to write a lot about human rights and politics. Berkeley was a little bit more radical in his empiricism. He had a little bit of idealism in his philosophy. He developed this system that's known as immaterialism. And immaterialism, which is kind of interesting as an empiricist, immaterialism is like inside out empiricism. Okay, it says that reality consists just of minds and their ideas, and that individuals can only know these ideas through experience. So because of that, an object or anything only really exists if someone is there to sense it. So there's your empiricist, right? So everything is really consisting of immaterial things like minds and ideas, but you can only know those through experience. You can only know what those ideas are through experience. And so um, an object really only exists if someone is there to sense it. So the big phrase to kind of sum up his idea is to be perceived. Okay, the last empiricist is Hume. So Hume thought that experience itself was the greatest, was as close as we're ever going to get to the truth. So he was very much an empiricist, but like a thorough empiricist, right? He thought that the way that you arrive at truth is through your experience. That's really the only way you're really going to know things. But he also said that any kind of experience and observation has to come in the form of a logical argument. So he I think this is really valuable because he wasn't just about going out and experiencing things. He did want to pull those experiences, pull the data from those experiences into arguments, into actual linear thinking, so that we could actually use them and develop conclusions about the world. He was a bit of a skeptic. He was also an atheist. Okay, as we move into the 19th century, before we get there, we run into somebody called Immanuel Kant. Okay, this is near the end of the Age of Enlightenment, and about 150 years after Descartes. So he was kind of a linchpin in this whole thing. When we get to Kant, we see a large, kind of like when we get to Descartes, we see a large shift. And the reason is because all this time, right, from early modern and even beyond in the medieval time, we have been basically fighting over the difference between empiricism and rationalism, and which one is the best route to arrive at truth, to arrive at real knowledge. And so he thought, why don't we just, he saw inconsistencies in both of them. So he thought, why don't we just combine these two and take the best out of both of them and try to come up with some conclusions based on that. So he sought to sort of move philosophy beyond this continual back and forth debate between, is it senses or is it reason? Is it senses or reason? Empiricism or rationalism? He sought to move the debate beyond that and create something new and perhaps look at things from different perspectives. So really, really valuable contributions, because I think without him, we possibly could still be just divided into these two camps, empiricism and rationalism. So this was a really big paradigm shift between the early modern period and the 19th century period in philosophy. So his deal, and that's why we have it titled there, his last name is spelled with a K, like up there at the title, Kant, but it said Kant. So a way to remember it is, why can't we all agree? Empiricists and rationalists, why can't we agree and come together? So he thought that we needed to combine things like appearance and essence. We needed to combine things like our awareness and our conception of things, as well as acknowledging the fact that we have predispositions when we look at the world, acknowledging the idea that we need to think through things, but also acknowledging the idea that we need to experience things. We do live in the world. We need to not just view the world as it appears to us, but we also need to understand it for its essence, what it is. So physical things have an appearance, right? But they also have an essence, like we have to understand what they are. We are aware of some things, but we can also conceive of some things. And Kant was thinking, why don't we just put those together? Why don't we say yes to all of that, instead of trying to divide it up? So he says, like, for example, without our senses, we can't become aware of any object. So we need the awareness, right? We need the senses. But without our reason, we can't identify a conception of an object. right? Without our senses, we can't determine the appearance of an object, but without our rational capabilities, we can't really identify what its essence is. So his job was to try to combine those two and to realize that they weren't really fighting. They're both kind of trying to get at. We need both. We need both sides. So this has. He also has a major contribution into the field of ethics. He came up with what's called a categorical imperative. This is sometimes called the law of the universal law, and it basically says that in ethics, the way that we ought to act, if we're going to come up with a normative rule for everybody, the way that we ought to act is in such a way that we would want our actions to become a universal law that's applicable to everyone in every situation. So if we're trying to figure out what to do in a certain situation, then we should choose that thing that we would want to become a universal law. It's kind of like the golden rule on steroids. Okay, so we would want to act in a way that we would want other people to treat us, but not only that, but we would want to act in such a way that we think that this should be a universal law for everybody. That's called the categorical imperative. He also had some questions on whether, and some statements to make about how we should not treat other individuals as a means to an end. And the categorical imperative helps with that no one should use any other human as a means to an end, as a pathway towards a larger goal. And so if you abide by the law of the universal law in your ethical decisions, that will help you avoid using people as means to an end. So far, all the way from the beginning, this is where we've been. We've talked about, way back in the pre-Socratics, we've talked about what exists and what is it like, right? We ask these questions. We've asked the questions of how do we think and how should we behave. Then we started asking questions about assumptions about God, and first identified that yes, there is a God, like especially in the scholastic period. Yes, there's a God. Plato sort of laid the groundwork for that. Then we started asking more questions about how do we know things? Is it through our reason or is it through our senses that we come to knowledge about things? And then now we're starting to talk about, does the non-physical exist? Do things that are not physical, do they actually exist? This is what Descartes started to explore when he was talking about the mind and about consciousness and about ideas. Then we started discussing more about whether or not there was a God, and the answer so far is no. We arrive at all knowledge, we arrive at our own conclusions without a God. It's either through it's either through empiricism or through rationalism. So this is where we are now, that knowledge by sense experience still is true knowledge, right? Things that we can sense, things that we can experience is held in higher value than any other kind of way that we go about gaining knowledge. That means then that discoveries and conclusions from the scientific method are superior to any other conclusions. It also means that religion or belief in God or many gods is not reliable or even real because we're not sure we know it for real, because we can't use our senses, or we can't use the scientific method to assess the reality of the existence of a God. So remember, we're asking the question about whether or not non-physical things exist, but we don't know for sure if they do. And so God is, by definition, in many definitions, a non-physical existing thing, and so we don't know for sure whether or not he exists. So we can experience things because of Kant. We can experience things and reason through things. I mean, we could always do this, but Kant gave us a little more validity to that idea. And then we also are starting to have some more guidelines for behavior based on our observations. So if we observe, this is Kant's categorical imperative, we observe that people are not a means to an end, and that we ought to act in such a way that we would want our actions to become a universal law. So we are starting to have some guidelines for our behavior. Ethics is taking a little bit more of a solid stance in our thinking.